Well, thank you all so much for having me today. We do have a Homeland Security Committee meeting going on today dealing with the Boston bombing, and so I will need to get back after my comments to that very important and timely topic. But I want to thank you all for having me. I want to begin thanking the Center for Security Policy for hosting this excellent and timely panel discussion today. My office, and specifically Rebecca Ulrich, Rebecca standing there, has worked with all these panelists, and I would readily admit that their depth of understanding has helped me develop a clearer and deeper view of the challenges and opportunities that exist in Latin America today. The U.S. does possess a long-standing relations with our neighbors, and I use the term here in our backyard, and I understand that the Latin American countries don't like that term. They don't consider this the U.S.'s backyard. I get that, but it's a familiar term. But we're all in a neighborhood together, and the way I see it, and that's my view, we do have to work with our neighbors here in the neighborhood. So simple geography and shared economic, political, and cultural, and security interests fuel these relationships. Yet I believe that the U.S. must do a better job of engaging our allies and partners here in the region. And I want to commend Chairman Salmon for recently taking a CODEL to go down and start understanding some of the relationships that we need, and also continuing to talk about the Iranian threat here in the Western Hemisphere that he mentioned, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But our security and interests depend on these relationships that we have here in this hemisphere. So the challenges that we face are a myriad of challenges here in Latin America. Exploding criminal violence from transnational criminal groups, growing sophistication from drug trafficking organizations, DTOs I'll call them later, illicit activities in smuggling, contraband, and people threaten every country in the region in one form or another. Honduras, for example, is the deadliest place in the world with more people per capita murdered than any other country in the world, including Iraq and Afghanistan. Mexico, which shares over 2,000-mile border with the U.S., has seen over 60,000 of its citizens brutally murdered by DTOs and other criminal groups. And this violence has spilled over into this country in our U.S. border towns, and we've seen Mexican DTOs operating in other U.S. cities. In March, Southcom Commander General John Kelly testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee, and he highlighted several key regional challenges. He said a crime and terror nexus between DTOs and terrorist organizations, Iran's increasing activity in the Western Hemisphere, a growth and outreach by external extremist groups from the Middle East, and Africa and South Asia within the Western Hemisphere, and the expanding role of China in the region. And I'll stop right there and mention, I was in Texas at the King Ranch talking to their security forces. King Ranch is the size of Rhode Island, 830,000 acre area. And they catch folks coming across their property that are OTMs other than Mexicans. They're catching Africans, Middle Eastern, Asian folks in just east of or north of Brownsville and east of Corpus Christi in Texas. And I thought that was an interesting statistic for him to tell me. And so that just continues to fuel my alarm. So I was encouraged to hear the General's frank assessment in light of the legislation that I introduced last Congress that Chairman Salmon talked about, countering the Iran in the Western Hemisphere Act that the President signed. Congress passed this legislation, the President signed it, and the Center for Security Policy was instrumental in supporting this legislation and helped raising awareness not only in the Congress but also nationwide, and so I certainly appreciate that. This law states that the policy of the U.S. is to use comprehensive government-wide strategy to counter Iran's growing hostile presence and activity in the Western Hemisphere by working together with U.S. allies and partners in the region to mutually deter the threats by Iran, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, the Quds Force, and Hezbollah. And the law requires the State Department to deliver a report to Congress with an assessment of the threat and strategy. And earlier this week, I think on Monday, I met with Assistant Secretary of State Roberta Jacobson, she's over the Bureau of Western Hemisphere, to talk about this issue. And I understand the State Department is on track to submit that report on time, which I believe is by the end of June. And so with last month's bombing attack in Boston and the foiled operation in Canada the next day, reportedly backed by al-Qaeda elements in Iran, I believe that this report will be an essential tool to counter the threat that Iran poses to the U.S. and our friends in this hemisphere. And I'll mention that Chairman McCall, the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, was on the subcommittee that I now chair last year, and he led on a CODEL down to South America to visit with Mexico, Colombia, Paraguay, and Argentina to focus on Hezbollah, focus on the tri-border region, focus on Iran's activity here, because he understands that as well. And I think it's an important note that he's now chairman of Homeland Security and has that vision, that's shared vision, I think will benefit us going forward. So compounding these challenges from Iran is Venezuela. As Chairman Salmon mentioned, with the death of Hugo Chavez 2 months ago, I had hoped for a different opportunity, a fresh start down there. For the people of Venezuela to freely and fairly choose a leader who would pursue justice and good governance domestically and pursue peace with its neighbors. I don't know that we're going to get that. However, Venezuela is off to a rocky start with unclear and potentially fraudulent election that Matt talked about. So Maduro and Maduro's continuance of Chavez's flaming rhetoric and antipathy toward the U.S. provides many reasons for concern that Chairman Salmon brought up, so I'm not going to reiterate that, but I hope the symposium and the panels here today will talk about that. So there are a lot of opportunities between the U.S. and Latin America, and while I could dwell on these challenges, I want to use my remaining time to mention the excellent opportunities that are here. First, we have an excellent opportunity with law enforcement military cooperation within the region and growing intelligence sharing with many of our neighbors. And I highlight the fact that Colombia had a relationship not only with the U.S. over a 10-year period, us investing a lot of money for their HELO operations, but just recently, as far as last year, my state, South Carolina, the National Guard joined in with Colombia as its newest partnership under the State Partners Program to provide long-term mentorship, advance democratic principles, and encourage healthy civilian-military relationships. So not only has our Air National Guard gone to Colombia, but the Colombians have come to South Carolina to view the operations and that we have in our Air National Guard there. So I look forward to that type of relationship. I believe those are partnerships that work as we work together with our neighbors. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security also has a federal law enforcement training facility located in El Salvador that's been instrumental in building partner capacity to disrupt the efforts of transnational criminal organizations. And I'll go back to Colombia. Now that they've gotten the U.S. training and they're more up to speed, they are actually bringing law enforcement from other countries into Colombia to help train. I think that's an important next step in that relationship. And we trained the Colombians in trafficking and countering drug trafficking and the cartels. Now they're utilizing that training to help train other countries that might not warm up to America as much, but they would warm up to the Colombians. And I think that's a good step in the right direction. We've got trade opportunities. Latin America and the Caribbean region as a whole is one of the fastest growing regional trading partners for the U.S. and U.S. maintaining 6 free trade agreements with 11 countries in the region. With 3 Latin American countries participating in the TPP or Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, Mexico, Chile, and Peru, as well as Canada, I'm very interested to see how this agreement will impact the Western Hemisphere. Additionally, the DHS and the State Department have been in discussions with the governments of Chile, Brazil, and Uruguay about the criteria for joining the visa waiver program. And that's going to get a lot of attention right now because of the Boston bombing and the Saudi visa waiver program or trusted traveler status and other things. So we're going to watch this very closely. But these countries, I think, may be worthy of that. And so I look forward to seeing how that conversation proceeds. And finally, we have a tremendous energy opportunity here in the Western Hemisphere, home to nearly a third of the world's oil, but we're finding more and more every day, so I think that number is a little low. Latin America and the Caribbean region has nearly 337 billion barrels of oil, over 20% of the proven oil reserves. The U.S. also possesses vast reserves of oil, natural gas, and shale gas reserves. This abundance of resources within the U.S. has opened up new possibilities for the U.S. to export, specifically LNG, liquefied natural gas, in significant quantities. And I know the Caribbean nations are very, very interested in receiving that LNG to help fuel their energy needs. And so even though the administration and the U.S. Department of Energy have put roadblocks delaying the export licenses and also the licenses for the building out of the export terminals, calling for a new review and question period, these are just delay tactics that put off implementation of things like the Keystone Pipeline, which is a Western Hemisphere issue. So this issue has resulted in from poor U.S. leadership and has allowed other countries to fill the void. Venezuela has been able to exert considerable influence on the region through its Petro-Caribe program, which has allowed it to provide oil to 18 Central American Caribbean nations on preferential terms since 2005. So I think energy is a segue to the U.S. and security within the region outside of Venezuela, which is the topic today. So with Chavez's death and the future of those Petro-Caribe programs, I think there's opportunity for the U.S. to step into that. I believe the U.S. should show leadership on energy policy to our allies and our partners here in the Western Hemisphere. The most fundamental action we can take is to implement the U.S.-Mexican Transboundary Agreement. That area between Mexico and Canada out in the Gulf of Mexico, that transboundary area, there's a U.S.-Mexican Transboundary Hydrocarbon Reserves Agreement, Reservoir Agreement, and I am the sponsor of a piece of legislation that will move us closer to adopting that so we can work with Mexico to get those resources that are basically owned by both countries and share that and create American jobs, more security, and safely. So I think that's important. H.R. 1613 is something that I and Chairman Salmon and Chairman Doc Hastings have all co-sponsored that would open up or move that agreement forward. And I think you're going to see that move through the Natural Resources Committee fairly rapidly. So in conclusion, while the Western Hemisphere faces some serious challenges, I believe we also have some great opportunities. The bottom line is the U.S. needs to lead. We've got to show some leadership. We need to engage our allies and partners in the region, and to a greater extent, more than we have in the past, I would say. So Latin America has increasingly become independent from the U.S., and I'm encouraged by the economic growth that I've seen by a lot of the countries. For example, zero unemployment in Panama, very low unemployment in Colombia, a focus on a very low debt to GDP ratio within Colombia, very capitalistic, free market Colombian nation, and also an understanding that they just want to have enough government to support a free market. I think those are principles that will be successful in Colombia. And however, the influence of Venezuela-led Bolivian Alliance for the Americas, or ALBA, has contributed to the anti-American sentiment in the region. With the election of Maduro, may only foment more of these views. So with many challenges facing our hemisphere, the U.S. must engage more frequently with our neighbors to come to common definitions of the threats we face, which are real, and develop strategies to successfully defend our interest. And I'll just end with one little story. We were down in the tri-border region in Ciudad del Este in Paraguay last year with Chairman McCall. And I shared this with Secretary Jacobson the other day. What we heard from the U.S. the dinner the night we got there, from state, from DEA, from CBP, and some others, was a completely different story than we heard when we were on the ground in Ciudad del Este going to the Brazilian border from the Paraguayan security and police force. The truth about Hezbollah, the truth about the financial transactions that are funding terrorism around the globe that happen in that tri-border region. And the reason I share that with you is Argentina's apparent movement toward embracing Iran a little closer, kind of deviating from past policies after the bombings there in, 93, 94, should be alarming to us that Argentina's posturing a little differently. So she and I had that conversation this week. She understands what we learned. She understands what we were hearing from state, which differed completely from what we were hearing from the Paraguayans and really what we saw there in the City of the East. So with that, I'll leave it. I know y'all have got a great panel. I look forward to hearing more about it. And I, again, appreciate you guys, Michael and Doug, for helping Rebecca and everyone helping our office as we move forward trying to make America more secure and countering these real threats to our national security. And so with that, I certainly appreciate it. God bless you.